PHC. Is that coming through? Good. Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah. So the objectives today, we're going to look at what is plant health care and integrated pest management. If those terms seem like a bunch of jargon, they kind of are, but we'll unpack that, what that means. It's all about monitoring and forecasting what's going on with pests or diseases in the landscape and how we reduce that off-target damage to the environment. So we're not just kind of going out there willy-nilly spraying chemicals on stuff. There's an intentionality and a science, a process to it. And that whole process has evolved, it continues to evolve over time to reduce the environmental impact of what we're up to. And then I'll go through the basics of the main insects and mites. And then I've got another PowerPoint coming up after that that deals with fungi, because insects and fungi are managed a little bit differently. It's still integrated pest management, but we approach each group of pests in their own way. So what is plant health care? Just so we kind of have a common definition of that. It's scheduled preventive maintenance, and the goal is to enhance plant vitality. So scheduled means like if you know that there's a recurring thing that tends to happen to a plant or a tree, you can have it booked into the calendar so you can hit it at the right time to make the most difference. This is not like there's places, I guess I can call out the name ChemLawn or whatever they call themselves nowadays, that they're leaving hangers on people's door in July saying, oh, we found apple scab and aphids and all the stuff on your place, you got to spray. Well, if you're getting people to spray apple scab in July, it's way past the time window when you can do anything about it. The doing it actually right is when the host is vulnerable to the infection by that fungus. So we would be scheduling the preventive maintenance at the right time. And the goal is not to eradicate the pests or the fungus out of the environment. It's to boost the vitality of the plant and reduce to a threshold where the plant can still live with it well. So it's based on integrated pest management and monitoring, keeping an eye on what things are actually doing. Cultural practices, we'll talk about that, like how's the irrigation happening? And, is there a weed whip that's damaging the base of the tree? All those other fundamental things about the tree. So it's not just about blitzing it with chemicals to keep something alive. That's not the main goal here. And part of it is, we have a responsible use of pesticide and fungicides. Like we're not just doing these out of out there just trying to kill things. Like we do have to kill some bugs, but we do it in a targeted, responsible way. So integrated pest management, really we're looking at preventing a pest from reaching economic or aesthetic damaging level with the least risk to the environment. So scouting visits to monitor the pest development. That's over the next handful of weeks. That's what Kyle and I do quite a bit. In fact, Kyle, I was going to mention when I walked yesterday to the hardware store, right now, scouting never stops for me. I'm always looking at, oh, I noticed there's lilacs breaking bud. So that means Pseudomonas blight is something that we have to put on the go list, actually. Yeah, so outside of this thing, Kyle, I'll just get with you about Pseudomonas, if we even have any of those jobs in queue. But scouting, there's a list of things that we're monitoring to be able to make the call on when those go on the list that we have to treat them. And tracking pest development with growing degree days, that's something I've been doing since, well, as the weather warms up, there's a mathematical formula that tracks how much accumulation of warmth there's been during a season. And that's what triggers the activity of insects and mites, like when they hatch out and when stuff gets ready to treat at the most vulnerable stage. So that's part of this monitoring. And then we'll treat only when it's necessary, because then it saves the customer money and it saves chemical use. Like there's no point in putting a bunch of chemical in the environment when it's not really targeted at the right timing to make a difference in what we're up to. Because reducing the off-target damage, that's all of what integrated pest management is about, you know. So we're looking at what's the rate of the leaf development in the spring, like the oak leafing out here. That will determine when, if the tree has anthracnose or bur oak blight, when we're going to start the treatments on that. Or this paper shake test here is the well-known monitoring for spider mites. You know, if you have a tree with spider mites on it, the spruce tree, you shake shake a limb over a white sheet of paper, and then you see these crawly things running over it, and you can run your hand over it and it leaves green streaks. That's the chlorophyll that the spider mite has sucked out of the needles. So you can count how many on a white sheet of paper and then know, okay, this is at the level of infestation to treat, and we're at that time of the season when they're starting to activate. So just examples of monitoring. And growing degree days, as I brought up, it's a formula where we're basically taking an average of the high and the low temperature for a given day. So the high plus the low, divide that by 2, and then the base temperature can vary, but the most common base temperature that we use is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that gives you a number called the growing degree day figure for that day. So what I've got is basically a spreadsheet that's a calendar where it's built to calculate this for me. I just put in the high and low temps in the forecast. And then you add that growing degree day figure for today to everything that happened in the days prior to that in a running total. So say by the time that number in late June is reaching 980 growing degree days, then I know that we're pretty soon gonna hit the Japanese beetle emergence of the adults, and they'll start feeding on trees, especially lindens. So the degree day timing, I've been tracking the degree days in our Twin Cities metro area for going on 10 years. And it's just a super accurate way for the insects and mites to know, to be able to forecast when they'll show up. You know, at different figures, when it hits 250, say that's when the sawfly larvae start to pop out. When it hits around 1,000 or 1,100, then the Japanese beetle is ready. So because insects are so tuned into the warmth that occurs during a season, degree days are part of how we track them. And this whole toolbox approach, we call it, for plant healthcare, what we're doing is assisting tree defense where the tree doesn't have the ability on its own to defend against a pest or a fungus attack. There's different modes of approach that we can take to that, whether it's spray applications that you do as a plant healthcare technician, the systemic insecticides that we inject into the soil, or root flare injections, you know, how we prevent Dutch elm disease, oak wilt, inject insecticide to keep ash trees free of emerald ash borer. But that's kind of a whole separate division. As plant healthcare techs, really, you'd be concerned more with spray applications and systemic insecticides, really. Because here's an interesting thing, like you see this downward blip in this chart. What this graph represents is the energy reserves that are stored in a tree as it moves throughout the time of the season. And as I was saying, we step in to aid the tree defense, and we're protecting it against energy depletion during this downward blip. Like you can see what happens is there's high energy reserves, and it's January, moves into spring, like just the period we're getting into, and there's a steep drop in the energy reserve, and then it climbs back up. Anyone have an idea what's going on there? Why is there that steep dip right now? What we're heading into? Any thoughts?
Well, the trees are starting to put out buds and leaves, and that's probably using up a lot of energy.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Thanks for that. That stored carbohydrate reserve that the trees built up last year, when the buds activate, that's going to draw upon stored energy. So that's a steep drop. And that also just happens to coincide with when spring sets in and when new leaf tissue is expanding, then it gets warm, it gets rainy, and we'll talk about that with the fungus diseases. That's when the leaf is the most vulnerable to attack. And it's also when leaf tissue is very easy for bugs like Eastern tent caterpillar to start feeding on it. So if a tree loses leaves, it's losing its ability to build up energy from the sunlight through photosynthesis. So what we're doing is stepping in to help protect the tree from leaf loss because that's its means of making a living with stored energy. So as you can see, that stored energy steeply climbs back up again and gets to a high level. So we're basically, this is why plant healthcare techs get really busy in the spring, is everything starts to happen all mostly at that one little blip of time. I mean, we keep plant healthcare techs busy all summer, but it really starts to get crazy come the month of May or so. So here's a big question in integrated pest management is, does it need to be treated? And there's different, you can look at different insect pests as deadly versus dramatic. That the dramatic pests, like the Japanese beetle, often they just cause aesthetic damage, showing up on linden trees, feeding on foliage, and certainly loss of foliage reduces energy going into the tree. But typically a tree has enough energy reserve to rebuild a new set of leaves. A deciduous tree can grow a new crown. If you lose some of that, it's usually not a big deal in a normally healthy tree. And the pests that cause leaf damage a lot of times just kind of have a cyclical nature about their population. They're bad for a couple of years and then they go away for a while. But the thing is, clients get motivated by the dramatic pests because they're really alarming, highly visible signs of what they're doing. They see these Japanese beetles all over eating the foliage and they freak out. But then on the flip side, you've got other kinds of bugs like emerald ash borer. They're more stealthy killers. They lay eggs that hatch. The larvae tunnel under the bark and they're feeding on the conductive tissue out of direct visibility. So that customer might say, well, I'll just wait and deal with that when the time comes. I don't see anything wrong with my tree. And as they're saying that, right that very moment, there's probably the larvae feeding on the conductive tissue. And a tree can't replace conductive tissue like it can replace a crown of leaves. So the consequences of that are much higher, for the tree. But a lot of times the deadly pests are the silent, stealthy killers that are kind of under the bark. So, if you're a consulting arborist or what, you're talking to a client about it and they're totally flipping out about Japanese beetle, but they want to ignore the EAB, there's kind of a teachable moment there. Like, really what needs to be treated is the deadly pest that's probably not showing up like a immediately visible thing. And they could let the Japanese beetle slide and it wouldn't be the death of the tree. But this is kind of a distinction I like to point out, like what things really need to be treated for life and death of the tree. And there's things too that we treat because, we just want to keep things looking good too at a certain threshold. And within our whole toolbox of stuff that we have at our disposal, there's systemic insecticides, 3 products that you'll see on your work orders that you're applying. And they each have their own rate of absorption, duration of effectiveness in treating pests, and a list of insects that they can control. Like the Lepitect is a thing that absorbs really quickly into the tree, and then you get about 30 to 40 days, like part of the growing season for effectiveness. So we might think, well, why are we doing that if it lasts only a short time? Well, that can be useful if you have a pest that's only bothering the tree for a short time and you can time that accurately and then have it gone out of there so it's not going to persist and come back into the pollen for next year that can affect the bees, for example. Then Transtect is the next on the list, where it takes a little longer to get into the tree, 2 to 3 weeks, but it'll last through the growing season. And then Zytect, longer uptake time, but lasts a full year. So we can, adjust our protocols accordingly based on what we're trying to work with and treat. So between the three of them, it's a really good, powerful toolkit. And just I like to put this historical context into this too. Like I had said in the intro, I started off in 1994 and spent my first couple of seasons as a technical arborist, doing plant healthcare stuff. And in the 90s, we did not have any systemic pesticides at all. And what the protocol was to treat two-line chestnut borer was to spray large oak trees 3 times per summer with Dursban. It's chlorpyrifos, a product that's not even on the market anymore. It's just considered too risky, too dangerous. So you can't even get that. But I was that tech, and we had these spray guns that were like, I think of them like an AK-47 on a hose. Like we're shooting chemicals 60 feet up into trees. And there was no way you could do that without having some drift, even on the calmest day. Like today, I'm just looking out my window and I can see the tops of trees moving back and forth. Like there would be no way you could spray anything today. Nowadays, we, well, A, don't have Dursban on the market, and B, we don't even use spray equipment that allows us to shoot that high, just as putting an upper limit on how much drift we can achieve with it. So then in the early 2000s, some of the systemic insecticides came on the market, especially imidacloprid formulations, which is our Zytect. Earlier on, it was just Merit from Bayer Corporation. But for all the bad press we get about systemic insecticides nowadays, especially neonicotinoid pesticides, if you put it into the wider sweep of IPM and historical context, the systemics have allowed us to hugely reduce the amount of pesticide that we're putting in the environment. Because just think of the comparison, shooting Dursban 3 times a season up into a crown of an oak tree and all that drift versus one treatment around the base where you put something in the soil, there's no drift. It's a small fraction of chemical. It absorbs into the tree, targeted exactly where that phloem feeding borer is going after the tree. You just do that once a year. You repeat that for maybe 2 or 3 seasons while the tree recovers its vigor and it won't be susceptible to the pest anymore, and you're done. So, while there's been, like I say, a lot of bad press about systemic insecticides, they have allowed us to hugely reduce the amount of chemicals overall that we're using. It's not to say that it's perfect. There's still room for improvement, but that's part of the thing with integrated pest management, is always looking at ways to improve the process and reduce the off-target damage. As part of that is now there's labels on things that could potentially go off target and kill bees, because bees have a really difficult time these days. A lot of it gets blamed on pesticides, but really there's a lot of other factors that are weighing in with that too, like habitat loss, monoculture of food sources, mites, viruses, all kinds of things. And actually pollinators, that's a whole subject unto itself. It's not just bees and it's not just honeybees. Like there's native bees and there's all kinds of other insects, and even birds and different creatures too are pollinators. So, we could go into a whole kind of side thing about that, but basically I'm bringing it back to the labels of products now require pesticide applicators to take into account like what's going to be the bee exposure in this situation, and don't have the stuff drift onto beehives if it's a spray. Or like for our systemic applications, are there flowers around the base of a tree, where if we treat this tree with Zytect, will the flowers around the base, people like to put plants around the base of their trees, always having a look at like how might this move off target in whatever ways when we're using it. But, hopefully that's taken into account before it even reaches the work order in the hands of a plant healthcare tech. So, the trees like lindens, crabapple, magnolias, black locust, the ones that are flowering, if there's flowering plants within that treatment zone, like within a foot or two of the trunk, then that should be avoided. Or, maybe they cut off the flowers, but not like we want to necessarily always trust the word of the clients that say, yeah, I'll just cut the flowers off for a season or two while this is being treated. I mean, maybe that will work, but we tend to just, like, usually the consulting arborist will identify that, like, okay, I'm not even going to treat that. We'll go at it a different way in dealing with this pest situation. Because the longer term, well, even the shorter term, like Lepitech, you treat, that could have the chemical go up into the pollen and the nectar of that flower and affect the bees. So we want to avoid that. So if we move on to insect classification, and then we'll get into some of the main insect pests that we deal with. There's a lot of ways you can classify insects, like the scientific families. The Coleoptera are beetles, Lepidoptera are like moths and butterflies, Diptera are flies. And that makes sense just from the biological perspective. But when we're managing them from the IPM perspective, what we'll do is look at them as feeding guilds, like what they do to the tree or the plant, or like what are the mouth parts that they have. Like a sucking insect is one where they can pierce and suck out juices out of like twigs or typically leaf tissue. Or chewing insects are ones that feed typically on leaf tissue, like your Japanese beetle or tent caterpillar or sawfly. And then the boring insects, not boring like they're not very interesting. It's boring like they bore into things. They can tunnel in and feed on phloem, or, they're basically have their life cycle is adapted to tunnel into things and bore. And here's the thing, I took this on close to 10 years ago when, part of why I do what I do is to create roadmaps for all of this information for myself and for technicians, anyone doing this, arborists. Like, this can all seem like a big ocean of confusing information, all these different bugs and stuff to keep track of. And I wish what had been in place for me when I started was some way to map it all out. And it just occurred to me one day, like, well, I'm a tree guy, I should map it out on a tree. Just like a branching key when you're learning to identify tree species, it's paired choices. And so I spent part of an afternoon drawing out all the insects and fungi that I knew in our area on a branching pattern like a tree. And it looks like this. So, I would invite anyone interested in taking this on, like, as you learn a new fungus or a new insect, you can just start a branching thing and build it out for yourself like this, where, okay, at the most coarse level of the branching, it branches out like there's fungal conditions and there's insects, and then there's abiotic, which just means non-living. In the non-living conditions, it'd be like, oh, there's weed whip damage or salt that's drifted from a road and damaged it. The things that are not like an insect or fungus. And then you go down the branch for the insects, and then there's the sucking insects, the chewing insects, the borers. Or if we're talking fungi, is it a foliar fungus or a decay fungus, vascular fungus like oak wilt or Dutch elm disease? And then as you fan out further into those, it could be like, okay, within the sucking insects, there's aphids and scales. And it just keeps getting finer and finer until you get to the actual insect. Like, okay, the borers, there's agrylus borers, and of the agrylus, there's two-line chestnut borer, bronze birch borer, emerald ash borer. And eventually you just have this whole big thing branched out with everything you know. And as you learn a new one, you just draw a new little twig or branch in there. So at least for me, I think this way in pictures a lot of times, and this has helped me a lot just to kind of have an overview of where everything fits together. So yeah, if this helps you take this on, I think it's fun to work with it this way. Oh, and here's actually the picture of the whiteboard that I drew all the stuff out for our area for a reference. So if we go to that sucking insects category, it's a mosquito is a sucking insect. You know, it's not of trees, of course, it's more they're after our blood, but their mouth parts are built for piercing and sucking out plant juices. And this would include mites. You know, mites are not insects, they're more related to like ticks and spiders. They have 8 legs, but we just sort of group them in with sucking insects because they pierce and suck out juices out of plants. So yeah, mites are arachnids. And well, Areophyids are a category of mites. They have 4 legs. And mostly we deal with spider mites that have 8 legs, but just group them in with sucking insects, things that suck. And the Areophyids, super tiny. They're spending the winter under bark crevices and bud scales. And often what they're doing is causing galls on trees, especially deciduous trees. And you'd need some pretty powerful magnification to even see these things. Like a hand lens wouldn't even probably do it, but they're out there. There's thousands of species of these that science hasn't even described or named yet. And it seems like every tree has at least one of them that causes some minor mayhem on them. So galls, really all they are is deformations in plant tissue, some of which are homes for the little baby mites, and some are just reactive responses to the feeding of a mite. Like that thing in the lower row in the middle that looks like apples. That was one I saw in California years ago. And I was out there visiting. I thought, well, it's pretty early for apples to be formed and ripening on a tree. And I stopped and I got out and looked at it. And I was like, oh, especially for apples to be on an oak tree. Like, see the leaves, that is a classic oak tree leaf. Like, what the heck? That was so weird. It just caught my eye. It makes a great picture. But usually these oaks are, or the galls are named for what they look like. Like this is oak apple gall. Or to the right of that, there's felt mite on river birch because it looks like this red felty stuff on the leaf. And these are all caused, well, either by a wasp or an Areophyid mite, but it's just weird deformations in plant tissue. They typically don't kill the tree or the plant, they just make part of it look weird. So when it's a reactive response to the feeding, that's like when you get a mosquito bite and you get this welt and it's itchy on your arm. You know, that's the reaction of your skin to the stuff that the mosquito inserts there to make your blood more, well, to thin out your blood so it can suck out some of it, and then your body reacts to it. So that's kind of like what a gall is on a tree. So ash flower gall, you see these on ash all the time, and it's not really a health threat to the tree. It just is aesthetic. It makes it look strange. And the previously existing galls stay on the tree after the treatments. And typically we don't even do these anymore. I'd be surprised if you even get work orders for it, but I just kept this on there because this is an example of something where people see this and it bugs them. And if they want to treat for this, but they're not treating their emerald ash borer, they're really kind of misguided because this is not harming the tree at all, but the EAB will kill the tree. And anyway, try to treat this, and you know, the treatments are not very effective also. Like it's very hard to time this in a way where you'll make a difference in reducing the galls. Plus the previously existing ones are still on the tree. It takes wind and rain and weather elements to tear the old ones off. All we're trying to do is suppress the new gall formation if we're doing that. But this is a classic example of something that looks dramatic to a client and they freak out. But if they don't want to deal with the fundamental problem, what would kill the tree, then, they really gotta, it's a moment to, educate them. Like, if you really want the tree to stay around at all, you got to be preventing the emerald ash borer.
Quick question for you.
Oh yeah.
When it comes to the different types of galls, are they all just basically aesthetically unpleasant to the eye, or are there forms of galls that are actually, detrimental to the tree itself?
In some cases, yeah, there's some that are detrimental to the tree. Like a few years ago, there was some crazy kind of galls on swamp white oaks, especially smaller ones, and the gall would infest the twig to the point where the twig would bend back on itself. And I had a client with a bad case of that in a small swamp white oak, and the structure of the tree just went all screwy looking. And I don't think it killed the tree, but there wasn't really a lot we could do, because, like, say you put Lepitect in there, by the time, well, so the mite, or I guess in that case it was probably a wasp, but either way, by the time the pest has fed on that thing to ingest the poison, the feeding is what triggers the reaction. So, it's kind of like slapping the mosquito after it already bit you.
It already bit you, right?
So you already got the itchy thing. But in most cases, it just makes a leaf look weird or a twig look weird. But in a few cases, it's so damaging to the tree that maybe the tree doesn't die, but it looks so dang ugly that the customer can't even stand to look at it.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, and if we're trying to spray them at the right time, it's really difficult to get there exactly when the feeding's going to occur. And yeah, so galls, I don't want to put too much time on those, but just kind of point out that they are a thing out there.
Right. Okay.
So, something that has shown up more on conifers in the past handful of years is these aerial phyad mites, and you might see some work orders for this. And if it's a heavy infestation on a spruce tree, it just looks dull and rusty. It doesn't have a vibrant green vitality to it, like on spruce and white pine. This is actually under magnification what one of these looks like. And, zoom in on a pine needle to the point where it's that big on your screen and you can see the stomata there, and it's just a little bit bigger than the stomata. They are this kind of like little carrot shaped thing, but their populations can blow up and really get to be a problem. But more typically, we got these spider mites, like the well-named two-spotted spider mite. You can see the two spots on their back. And with a hand lens, you can usually see the eggs before they've hatched out. And most commonly, these are going to be on your conifers, like spruce, arborvitae, pines, firs, junipers. And here on the arborvitae, you can see that it's called stippling, where they've pierced and sucked out the chlorophyll, so it doesn't have that uniform green across there. And up in that upper right, there's one of the spider mites, and then a couple of her eggs just on the edge of the needle there. So these are pretty common. We can treat them with Lepitect or a spray called Forbid. And here's how that kind of looks. Is the spider mites on conifers are what we call cool season mites. They're active in the shoulders of the season, like mid-May through early June in the spring, and then in the fall they start running again. And in the summer, they're just eggs that go dormant. Like you're above 80 degrees steadily, spider mites on conifers, the activity tails off. And there's other spider mites that get on deciduous trees that are active during the summer, but their frequency is way lower than what we see in the conifers. So there will be a couple of spells where you're going to be dealing with spider mites coming up in the spring. So yeah, here the warm season ones, here and there, we get them on a honey locust or some of the fruit trees, but it's similar in that the leaf looks like it's had little dots sucked out of it. They do the same kind of things. It's probably not, I don't think it's the same species. There's other species that show up on different kinds of trees, but they act the same way. They can have sudden spikes in population and suck out a lot of plant juice. And this would be in any of these cases where the tree has been stressed, like drought, soil compaction, etc., that kind of thing. A normally healthy tree won't really be that attractive to spider mites, and you probably will have, well, in a landscape that has diverse plantings in it, that's part of the whole IPM process too, is promote vigor of the trees by proper watering, not compacting the soil, using the air spade to mix in organic matter, have diverse plantings around in your landscape that favor beneficial insects, so then you don't need to go in and respond to outbreaks like this. Or if you do, it's very limited, and then you can have like the natural controls restore themselves with time. Aphids are a sucking insect. They suck out plant juice. And then one of the more noticeable side effects from aphids is they can only digest a certain amount of the carbohydrates they're sucking out at one time. So they excrete the rest. In other words, they poop out the sugars, and then that becomes this sticky residue, and that starts to mold. It looks black, and it's called sooty mold. So that makes aphids a real nuisance. Like typically they're not enough to really kill a tree or damage much tissue. They might cause some leaves to kind of fold and curl up, but the bigger problem is just this stuff drips on decks, patios, different areas that people are doing stuff, or on their car, like in front of my house. Well, I kind of got it's a weird deal. If I park under the hackberry, then the birds crap on the car because they're eating the little seeds off the hackberry. If I push a little further with the car and park under the linden, then I get honeydew on the car from the aphids. So I just park in the back where there's no trees by my garage. I let my wife park out front. She can take her pick if she wants honeydew or bird crap on the car. But hopefully there's like that space between the trees where there's not residue from some kind of critters up in the trees. But hey, I love trees, right? Don't get me wrong. I just don't want to park under them. So here's, this is a cool picture. Aphids, we can treat them with systemics. These are an easy target for any of those systemics I mentioned. Insecticidal soap sprays for people that want more of the green option. Not a lot of people end up, whoops, I want to go back to that. Yeah. Not a lot of people end up doing insecticidal soap sprays. It is in our list of protocols we can do though. But really, ladybugs are major predators of aphids. Like when ladybugs are adults or when they're larvae, they're on the hunt for all these kind of things like aphids, scale crawlers. So any of these beneficial insects that we can foster and have around are really great. If you don't know what a ladybug larva looks like, actually, I should have put a picture of that in there. They kind of look like a little alligator almost, and they have similar colors to the adults. But if you see those around during the season, they're actually on the hunt for stuff like aphids. Scale insects, there's a lot of kinds of them, and they are a sucking insect. They attach to the plant like an aphid, but they don't move around. They just stay in one place and build a protective covering over themselves and suck out plant juices. Like the pine needle scale. From a little bit of a distance, a pine needle scale infested tree looks like it's had that Christmas tree flocking over it or splattered white paint, but up close, it's the little white flecks. Those are the covers of the scale on there that make a protective coating over themselves. But these are pretty easy to treat with Transtec. That'll knock them out pretty readily. Magnolia scale is by far our most common scale that we're treating, and This is one that makes a huge amount of this honeydew, like in June with a magnolia that's got real active infestation. It'll be dripping this liquid out of it like it just was rained on, but it's on a dry day. You know, you can just watch the stuff dripping off the tree and it's falling down below on the landscape and turning black with this mold. And then a little later on in the season, hornets and wasps start coming after it because, you know, anything that's sweet or sugary that will attract them. And that's often what ends up getting people's attention, is just they all of a sudden have this, you know, hornet interest in their tree. And a lot of times the magnolia is planted right by the front door. So they got the hornets coming into the house, and, you know, no one likes that either. So there's, you know, a few things that we can do. There's, well, distance, we just switched out. It's actually RTSA, or Scientific Advancements, has a replacement for distance called Proxite, but an IGR is an insect growth regulator. That just means the scale, the babies, the young ones, have a crawler stage where they're crawling around. They've hatched out by the thousands. They crawl around looking for a new spot to settle, pierce in, and build a cover over them. Like if we go back to this, those beige, white looking things are the scale covers, where it's the parent one that has settled in and it's sucking out the plant juice. And then they'll lay eggs under those covers. And at 2000 growing degree days, that typically happens in August. That's when these crawlers hatch out and start running all over. And with the naked eye, you can see them about at the scale of like little ground pepper size things, but with a lens, it comes up even closer. I actually have video of this from the same picture. And yeah, actually you can kind of see the crawler cover there, or the scale cover off to the right that they've hatched out from. If you watch this in real-time video with all these things moving, it gives you the creeps and you feel like you got ticks on you or something. But it is pretty cool, like, to have a video of that. So when the crawlers emerge in August at 2000 degree days, then we go out, hit them with this Proxite spray. And what that does is it's a growth regulator. It keeps them from developing into their full maturity. So they just kind of stop their activity, and it works really well on them. But the reason we use that is reduces off-target damage. Like a general insecticide could kill any other insect that shows up there. But say there's a ladybug that shows up, that's already an adult at that point. So if it's feeding and it happens to get some of this Proxite IGR on it, it's not going to damage that bug. It's not going to damage the beneficials there. It's just going to stop the young ones from doing their full development up to where they're trying to get to. We also use systemic soil applications on these. Like any of the systemics will work, but we tend to avoid Zytect because that lasts a whole year, and magnolias are a flowering plant. So we don't want to have the stuff going to the pollen of that. So you won't see really Zytect for magnolia scale. We're not supposed to use that. And then dormant oil spray. That's just an oil that coats the plant while it's still dormant, either before it started to leaf out or after the leaves have gone dormant. And that's just a coating that suffocates the existing scales on there. Since magnolia scale, typically it's a three-pronged approach because it's kind of a tough thing to control. When there's an insect that has a covering over itself, you know, the protection works pretty well that it's evolved to have. But if we hit it consistently over a couple of years with these three things, in many cases we can do pretty well with it. And it seems like that insect growth regulator is working pretty effectively. Ash plant bug, also on stressed trees. You know, the ash that are in compacted soils with rock mulch and a parking lot cutout are the ones that will get this. But, you know, easy to hit with systemics or sprays. honey locust plant bug, very similar. Permethrin is a generalized insecticide that will kill pretty much any bug you put it on. So that's a pretty common one in the toolkit. So that was a good overview of the sucking insects. Now the chewing insects, their mouth parts are adapted to consume leaf tissue. And that's easier to attack than other parts of the tree. Like woody stuff is harder to chew on for most insects, but leaf tissue, it's nutritious. It has sugar and water in it and a lot of nutrients. So that's a big payoff for an insect that can eat that. And most of them, a lot of them, they're eating while it's easy, while that new leaf tissue is just expanding. It's soft and spongy stuff. But some of them, like Japanese beetle, they're hitting in the middle of the summer when the leaf is mature and it's more hardened off. But Japanese beetle is just like a feeding machine. They'll feed on mature leaves and it doesn't even stop them. Tent caterpillar, that's one of those that hits really early before the leaf tissue is hardened. And there'll be big fluctuations from year to year. Might have huge populations for a couple of seasons and then they just totally disappear. But they can completely strip out a tree, out in rural areas where you've got aspens, for example. It seems like tent caterpillar can just blow up and strip out leaves from an entire grove of aspen trees. And usually those affected trees recover and build new leaves. It tends to not be a big deal. When you look at some of the integrated pest management reports, I get emailed to me from Ohio, Maryland, different places like that from Extension Service. They point out how these are actually food sources for birds, and even wasps and hornets will attack these and take them to their nest and chew them up and feed them to their young. So, there's, in the whole scheme of things, these are food for other creatures, but if they're in someone's backyard, we try and knock them down, spray them, or treat them with Lepitect just to reduce the devastating defoliation if we can avoid it. Now, much more common chewing insect we'll run into is these conifer sawfly larvae. They're the same color as the needle generally, so it's easy to overlook them from a little bit of a distance, but you get up close and you just see hundreds of them crawling along a twig and chewing off needles like this. So it seems like in a short amount of time, they can just strip out branches on a conifer tree. And this is one of those that's very triggered by degree day timing. I know when that hits 240, 250 on my chart, the phone's going to ring like, hey, Kent, there's Mugo pine with sawfly on it. It's like, boom, I knew it. Just exactly when the degree day chart indicates that. So the way we treat these is a common pattern for most of the chewing insects. Like we'll hit them with that permethrin for the knockdown of that current population, and then follow up with Zytec with a systemic that will stay in there. And then next year's needles will have the insecticide built in and they feed and it takes care of them. So you won't need to spray the next round. The knockdown spray is just like at the first arrival when you see it and it's a new population, you got to knock them down as soon as you can. And then the systemics are, very good at keeping these in check. But there's sawflies on deciduous trees too, like on azaleas. There's a few that show up, and dusky birch sawfly, that's kind of cool, like around the perimeter of that leaf, and they're kind of curling up into that F-shaped pattern. So also similarly, relatively easy to control. And, on a deciduous tree, they're not going to kill the tree. On the conifer trees, I'm going to go back. You can see how it's just stripped out that branch. And what tends to happen is on a conifer, that new bud pops open and grows some needles. So then the sawflies have their couple of weeks of feeding and then they go away, they drop off and land in the soil and hang out in soil until they emerge the next year, like the next batch of them. But the new needles then form a tuft. It kind of looks like a poodle tail. So you can tell on trees that have had repeated sawfly infestations where there's kind of like a bare spot and a tuft of green, and then a bare spot on the branch and a tuft of green, where they just kind of repeatedly have been attacking. But I've also watched trees with sawflies, like robins, come flying by and they stop and they just gorge on these things, but birds are not going to be thoroughly scouring out the whole population, and it only takes a few of them to build up, and over a course of like a weekend they can cause a lot of damage to a tree. And a conifer is not going to build new needles into those gaps. It's just going to end up staying that way for the rest of the life of the tree. There's a whole group of sawflies called leaf miners, and way back in the 90s, before there were systemics, we had to spray for birch leaf miner. It was a super common pest, and I don't know what happened. Like, they basically are not even a thing we do much of, if at all, anymore. Maybe we were so effective we just eradicated them, but they were, sometimes that happens with insect populations. Like, a pest can be in an area for a while and completely disappear. It can be in a place where it has periodic cyclical populations forever. It can show up and just become a resident, like they're figuring emerald ash borer made its way here, it'll be here forever. So each insect kind of has a different way that plays out with its population over the long term. But what a leaf miner is, it's a sawfly species that instead of feeding on the tissue in whole, it just eats in between the upper and lower surfaces of that leaf. So like on an elm leaf miner, you'll see these dead kind of grayish tan patches in there. And in that birch, if you get it at the right time, you could actually see the insect in between the little papery skins of the upper and lower surface. So on to Japanese beetle. Japanese beetle, most common chewing insect that we treat. And it's kind of odd. Most insects will just feed on one kind of host, but there's a few generalists, like the tent caterpillar likes to feed on aspen, but you could find it on a lot of different things. Japanese beetle loves roses, lindens, grapevines, crab apples, birch, perennial plants. I've even seen them feeding on tamarack trees, but the ones listed here are the most common hosts by far. And what they're going to end up doing is, we call it skeletonizing, where like the veins are left and they're just feeding on the tissue in between the veins. So it leaves it looking like a skeleton. Or a thoroughly chomped linden tree just looks kind of dull gray tan, as that foliage is just stripped. But the leaf stalk and veins are still there. So this is another one that I used to growing degree days to forecast when to expect these showing up. And what's tricky with Japanese beetle too is they really love lindens, and lindens are a flowering tree, not flowering in the sense like a crabapple or magnolia, but if you've never hung out under a basswood or a linden during late June, take a moment to do that this upcoming season, because the flowers is just like this overpowering perfume. It's really lovely. Or if you go to the farmer's market and get honey that's made from bees that have foraged on basswoods or lindens, it's amazing. The flavor carries over into the honey. It's just out of this world. But so you got bees flocking to lindens in mass numbers, and it happens just about the time just before adult Japanese beetles are showing up to feed on these lindens. So we want to time it accordingly. Like, we don't want to be out there spraying for Japanese beetles at the same time when there's bees on the tree. Or at least previously, the chemical we would use to knock down the Japanese beetles was permethrin, but that's as lethal to bees as anything else. So nowadays, we've switched part of our IPM approach to this product, acelepryn, because of its low environmental impact, low toxicity to most of the non-target creatures, including birds, fish, and bees, but super effective on Japanese beetle. Like, one application lasts up to 28 days. A typical contact pesticide might have a week activity. Acelepryn lasts 4 times that long. And what it's doing, it paralyzes the muscles, the chewing muscles of the jaw parts. So if they can't move their jaws, they just basically starve to death. And a bee is not interested in chewing on leaf tissue. They're interested in just going after nectar or pollen that would not even have this stuff in it, because this is sprayed and it's on the leaf tissue. It's not really absorbing. And even if it did get to that part, it's not with a mode of activity that's going to hinder what they're doing. They're not chewing. So I've seen trees, when we were vetting this out a couple of years ago on sites that we'd sprayed, it was like a couple of weeks after our spray, there's bees visiting the flowers on this tree, just hanging out fine, cruising around. And the Japanese beetles on there just slowly, sluggishly, like you could tell they took a couple bites, and then it was like they were hit between the eyes with a baseball bat or something. They're just stung off, and like they're not able to chew or feed, so they're starving to death. But really great product to reduce the off-target damage and still get good control. Okay, bring it into the borers, and then we can wrap it up, take a quick break, and move on to the fungi. But the borers, as I was saying earlier, these are deadly to the tree, but not dramatic in their onset. And the main ones we were talking about would be bronze birch borer on birch, two-line chestnut borer on oaks, and emerald ash borer. So two-line chestnut borer, in the name, really it should be called two-line oak borer. Presumably when the American chestnut was really more of a dominant tree about 100 or so years ago, that's when this had its name given to it. But the chestnuts are largely gone because of chestnut blight. And then the insect, in its effort to not go extinct, just jumped over to the next host, oak trees. And that's how we know it now. So we should just rename it two-line oak borer. But since these, they're all three in the same genus of Agralis or Agrilis, however you want to say it, they all look the same if you put those three side by side in the adult stage. Like this bronze birch borer looks pretty much identical to an emerald ash borer. And if you put a chestnut borer next to it, it'd look the same, but it would have two stripes on it. That's how it gets the name bilineatus. Agralis bilineatus is two lines. But this is a picture I happened to get a few years ago. I was talking to a group of consulting arborists, and I said, in your whole career, you'll probably never even see the adult bronze birch borer because they're flying around up in the crown laying eggs. Then that larvae tunnels in, feeds on the foam, and then they exit, and you probably never see them. So 2 hours later, I'm out at a site thinking, what are all these things flying around this birch tree? And one of them lands right in front of my face on the trunk. And I'm looking at it going like, wow, that looks like pictures I've seen of an adult bronze birch borer. So I took a picture, texted it to the U of M entomology guy and said, okay, it's a bronze birch borer, right? And he's like, what else could it be? Like, it's right there. So nature's always looking for a way to make a fool of you. When I just had told the group, you probably never see this, there it was right in front of me. But since these are all in the same genus and act the same way in how they attack the tree, we can treat them all pretty much the same way too, with the same protocols. Because whether you're talking about the chestnut borer, the bronze birch borer, or an EAB, they'll leave that same D-shaped exit hole when they tunnel their way out of the bark and they've turned from that larvae into an adult. Since the back of the head is flat and the bottom is rounded, when they chew their way out, it looks like the D shape. Like 12-point font on a piece of typing paper, capital letter D is about what that looks like on a birch. So since the borers, they're feeding under the bark, they can be difficult to detect, and they're shielded from enemies and pesticides. Although when we do injections and we do soil applications, that goes into the phloem, and it's pretty effective if you get to the tree before it's really, too heavily thinned out. It's all about getting there at the right time. There's other borers that are not agrylus, like you got Zero-and pine moth, there's clearwing borers of ash and lilacs, and there's conifer bark beetles, but they're a much smaller percentage of what we're dealing with. Typically in the whole toolkit, soil applications take care of borers pretty readily, or root flare injections, or some of them are trunk sprays. Like if you get a Zimmerman pine moth, that's going to be a trunk and limb spray, because our products don't go to the part where they're boring into. So we have to hit them on their way in or out of the tree that they're infesting. So, okay. I was figuring an hour for that piece, and I'm right on time. Integrated pest management, plant healthcare. It's all about reducing the off-target damage, and we're aiding tree defenses at their weakest point. And there's a bunch of different strategies and tools, and the insects fall into sucking, chewing, and boring categories. Any questions on that stuff before, we want to take about a 5-minute break? Is that okay, Kyle?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a question. Does Rainbow do any surveillance for pests that aren't here yet, like spotted lanternfly or Asian longhorn beetle?
Oh, yeah. Actually, there's the scientific advancements part of the company that has the whole nationwide scope of what they're up to. There's like the territory arborist for that whole Atlantic seaboard region has an eye on that. And then, we've developed protocols for all the things, like not just in our own metro market where we started, but scientific advancements is looking at the whole country. So yeah, and then this idea of the degree days and the pest tracking calendars, they've built that out for different cities and regions. So yeah, I'm just tracking it for our immediate market here, but it does happen for other places too. Yeah. Yeah, good question. All right, cool. Anyone else?